Hello, Latinos in Clinical Research. Welcome to a very exciting monthly webinar. We've got two people from the Node Group, Sabrina Ramkilawan. She's the Chief Operating Officer at Node Group, Inc. And we've got Jaspreet Grewal, founder, researcher, venture partner, board director, also with Node Group. And Node Group, for those interested, I mean, a lot of people are interested in this topic, myself included. This is a female-led global CRO and consultancy. They are leaders in plant-based therapeutics and psychedelics. So you talk about a niche, but a very rapidly growing niche, and especially in Canada, where there's a lot of this. Canada's really on the forefront of this type of research. And maybe that's a good place to start. Why do you guys think that's the case? Why Canada, Sabrina or Jaspreet, whoever wants to go? And by the way, thank you both for coming on.
Thank you so much. Should we start with introductions or go right into it?
Let's do introductions and then let's get into why Canada, because I'm interested in that.
Sure. So Sabrina Ramkilawan, I am the CEO of Node Group. Excited to be working with Jaspreet and a great team of people. My background, registered nurse, and I'm also on the board for MAPS Canada. So there's another tie-in for the psychedelic side, and really kind of running kind of the operations, overseeing kind of the clinical trials that we do. We do the clinical trials and support that like a typical CRO, but we also do consultancy. Because if you think of psychedelic companies, they're very much like emerging biotech, where there's sometimes a lot of hand-holding, and a lot of times the people that are running psychedelic companies don't come from pharma necessarily. So there's that kind of learning curve and helping them along the way. So that's a bit of my background. And as you know, we connected. I'm also the president for Clinical Research Association of Canada. And I'm going to pass it on to Jaspreet. So that's a quick snapshot.
Thanks, Sabrina, and thanks, Dan, and thanks to the committee for having us today. It's a real pleasure to be here. So as Sabrina mentioned, we're part of Node Group. We're the founders of it. So I'm the CEO of the company, as well as wear several other hats similar to Sabrina, mainly in the general life sciences ecosystem and venture capital space. And we started our company essentially by merging two independent consulting firms that we both had. Sabrina's a registered nurse, I'm a clinician, but we've both been involved in clinical trials and regulatory affairs for about 20 plus years apiece. So a lot of experience in the space, just like most of the audience here as well. What brought us to this particular industry is we saw a gap in the cannabis industry initially about 3 years ago or 4 years ago now, and started to support clients with doing clinical trials in that space. But we quickly saw and learned that a majority of our work right now, so about 60% of our work, is actually helping psychedelic companies perform clinical trials and repeating what Sabrina said, that strategic advisory component of it. So very quick overview, that's what we do.
In terms of Canada, just a lot of psychedelic companies are setting up shop here in Canada. But a lot of them, even though they have their company here, a lot of them are looking for bigger markets. So looking at conducting clinical trials in Europe, and obviously US is a big pull, it's a big population. So most psychedelic companies are looking at market in the US through FDA, but FDA is more challenging. So typically, a lot of times we're guiding people to do clinical trials in Canada. Health Canada has put out some stuff that makes it a little bit more easier to do those trials. We are doing trials in the UK, in Australia, just because the regulatory is a little bit easier. But we always have the plan to go to the US, especially when you look at breakthrough therapy and stuff like that. Not sure if that answers why, but just a lot of, and maybe it's because there's been so much cannabis companies. We do see some people crossing over onto the psychedelic side. Yeah. I don't know if you have anything to add about the Canada side, Jaspreet.
I'll maybe stop and let Dan jump in with some more questions for now.
I was going to say it makes sense. I mean, the regulatory environment usually paves the way for industry to follow, and it seems like in Canada, for some reason, they have been early on this, which is good because there's a lot of regulatory burdens in Canada and other areas and other industries, but when it comes to psychedelics and cannabis, not so many. So compared to the rest of the world, especially the United States, where it's still pretty difficult to get studies done, depending on the various schedules, schedule 2, 3, 4. But can you guys talk a little bit about your relationship with MAPS? We had them on last month for our webinar, and it was a really good webinar. Can you guys kind of give us a little bit of background as to your guys' relationship?
Yep. Sabrina, do you want to take a stab at that?
For some reason, you cut off a little bit for me. I don't know if that happened. So I didn't hear the whole question.
Oh, MAPS, because we had MAPS on last month.
Okay, got it.
And you mentioned them, so I was just curious, like, how do you guys work together?
So MAPS US is different than MAPS Canada. So I'm on the board specifically for MAPS Canada. So
Okay.
But in a general ecosystem respect, MAPS has really paved the way. And to Sabrina's point, MAPS Canada, the United States are also structured very differently. We really look at MAPS USA as really pioneering, if you will, the way for clinical trials in this particular space. They actually got their MDMA study through to phase 3 at the moment, as you probably heard on their podcast, which is really exceptional. And MDMA is actually the front runner sort of molecule and compound. If we look at the general classification of psychedelics out there, that'll most likely hit the FDA first. And MAPS is so well structured, almost like a pharma company, if you will, in the United States, whereas Canada is like an industry support to lend a hand. And for obvious reasons, we're a much smaller country, financially, not as much money going into MAPS Canada as the US, but MAPS Canada certainly works as a way to support the industry, support the growth, education, and fostering of education of why clinical trials are so critical in this particular space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we do a lot of events. Recently, MAPS Canada did sponsor an MDMA trial. It's a separate MDMA trial here in Canada that looks at if someone has MDMA, they would go through therapy and MDMA with their significant other partner. Doesn't have to be marital, it's their significant other. It could even be somebody with a parent or whatever that relationship is. So it's a different study, but it's also looking at PTSD, MDMA, but just looking at it from a couple's point of view. So you're going through the journey with someone else.
And who's funding these studies? Is it the
MDMA Canada has given financial support for it. And part of being on the board, we're looking for other opportunities to encourage clinical trials here as well in Canada.
Interesting, because I remember, thinking back to in my research of COVID and everything that surrounded COVID research, there was a lot of similarities to HIV and AIDS. And then all these groups started forming to like NIH partnered or offshoots of the NIH, National Institute of Health, to fund a bunch of these programs. So are we seeing something similar to that in Canada?
You do see separate funding partners and bodies emerging. So in Canada, similar to the United States, you do have strong academic centers that have been working in psychedelic research for about 10 plus years. Mm-hmm. And now they're becoming as emerging partners, primarily because of the relationships between the researchers and the academics. So it really is those key individuals or stakeholders that kind of bring together organizations. So researchers sort of sharing. In Canada, same thing. We do have private institutions donating funds to further research, either psychedelic associations, or you have PTSD or veterans associations that are doing that, public health groups. And then you do have at the University of Toronto, I believe it is, they have a separate private foundation or semi-private foundation that's essentially given almost an endowment to further research in this particular space. So you do see a good mix of both public and private funding in Canada towards this area. I
see. Are there like companies working? Can there be multiple companies working on MDMA, and can they be? Do they have to have individual patents for the IP, or how does that work?
Yeah. I can probably start with this question. So from the IP standpoint, you're dealing with most of these products start with a natural basis. So there is no IP claim over it. IP becomes very difficult when you formalize or synthesize the molecule. So you go a synthetic route, say for psilocybin, or you further synthesize MDMA, you can put IP claim against it, but Merck actually synthesized MDMA a very long time ago. So Merck actually owns it, technically.
Merck owns it.
So, but again, you can challenge patents, but where patents become a realization in this particular field, similar to cannabis, is through formulation, extraction, and methodology, as well as drug delivery systems. So because we're dealing with natural compounds, it makes it very difficult. Most people, like any company that has their own product or formulated, can go through clinical trials. IP is a very sticky area right now.
So for example, let's say that I'll give cannabis as an example. Let's say that you have natural cannabis, right? With on its own, it's difficult to patent if you're looking at flower. But let's say you take that natural extract and now you put in a tablet formulation and you put a specific formulation with it, right? You can patent that, right? So similar to, what you can do, you can start with a natural product, but you need to kind of look at what's unique about it in terms of the patent.
I see. Okay, so then it would still make sense for somebody to take this through phase 1 all the way through phase 3 and do the clinical trials. What's the most exciting part of this? Like what are some of the latest indications that show the most promise?
So certainly like major depressive disorder, alcohol use disorder, PTSD is a major area, eating disorders as well. We've seen there's actually 3 clinical trials happening focused on eating disorders at the moment. Traumatic brain injury, concussion is one area. Pain and oncology associated pain is there too. So with psychedelics, you do see a bit of crossover between different therapies, but it does focus around the mental health or the addiction component of many things. And of course, there's a lot of push for PTSD. We do have emerging evidence already that there are front runners. Ketamine falls under the classification of psychedelics, and we have long established data and clinical data and evidence supporting that use already. And of course, it's already been commercialized, if you will, as S-ketamine and first-line therapy in a number of jurisdictions. Psilocybin's pretty a front runner in PTSD, MDMA in major depressive disorder, as well as traumatic brain injury. And you have the smaller molecules coming on board too, like DMT. There's exploration of ibogaine, and now there's subcompounds coming onto the market too for exploration. So pretty big area still.
I think the exciting thing is looking at, even because we are already seeing PTSD happening and depression, anxiety disorders, but it's interesting to look at traumatic brain injury because that in itself has a lot of impact, especially on depression, suicide. And when we look, that even kind of transfers to athletes, or anybody that's playing sports. I mean, I've had patients that are like 13 and playing, football, 14. So, you're looking at that whole area of traumatic brain injury.
TBI is huge, especially in in sports, football, hockey. I mean, boxing. I think we're just scratching the surface of what really lies underneath that when you really analyze what's going on there. So I didn't realize that psychedelics are playing or could potentially play a role in that. We have a comment, and by the way, if you're in the chat, put them in the comments. TBI and addiction go together too. So if you're somebody that is interested in this space, and let's say you have a research background, let's say you've been a coordinator or a CRA for years, traditional studies, right, multi-therapeutic, and you're interested because you want to go to where the future's headed, and you think, okay, this is, if nothing else, it's interesting, but I also believe the future's headed in this direction. What do you recommend they do to get involved in this space?
So I think there's a few different layers to this. So one, operationally, you do need to work at a center or a facility with a background in psychiatry, oncology, anesthesiology, chronic pain, or a multidisciplinary research center, CTU. That's critical, as well as those that possess controlled substance or DEA research licenses. That's the other critical component. And having a bit of a regulatory background, having worked in these controlled substances, is going to be very helpful. I think the second thing is working in those therapeutic areas too, understanding the nuances of it, and we see this with clients, and this is what kind of makes us makes us very different and unique from traditional CROs, is that we provide a lot of consulting services that otherwise would not be understood or afforded to clients from traditional groups. So set and setting is critical in psychotherapy. So how do you prime a site? So site feasibility is very different when we deal with psychedelics. It's not a traditional setting. You still have to go through the rigors and the criteria. From an operational standpoint, it's a security setting that you need to look at. It's who is part of the psychotherapy itself, but then also what does the physical space look like? So I would say like those are areas. So if you do want to be part of this emerging area, certainly starting to work with groups in the neurology, in the TBI space, psychiatry, mental health, those are great areas because that's where we see the immediate need for the next 3 years at least for studies to go.
Yeah, and even if you want to connect with people, going to conferences, even if they're virtual, because we're seeing a lot more psychedelic niche conferences and start getting to know the environment, who the people are, starting to make those contacts. We've hired people just because they reached out and said, hey, I was at that virtual conference and I'm really passionate about psychedelics and this is my background. We just hired a CTA and it was just from a conference because she's like, I really want to do this. And we're like, okay, what's your background? So she didn't specifically have the background, but she was really passionate and we were looking for someone to fill, right? So
you're encouraging people to contact you on LinkedIn.
Not necessarily,
say, hey,
but
Sabrina,
yes, they did.
You just did that.
Well,
Awesome.
we do need project managers.
Okay.
That's always something we're looking for in CRAs. That's probably the bigger
Everyone's
one.
looking for CRA, right?
Yeah. So those are probably the big ones, but it's also just, people who have a niche of regulatory background with these types of substances, or they've gone through breakthrough therapy before, so they know how to do it with FDA, like those kind of niche things that you might think that you might not even realize you have. And you might go, oh, wait a minute, don't necessarily have to live in Canada. Actually, the project manager we have for this project now is in the US. And because she had oncology, like she just had all the right fits for the project.
Yeah, that's one of the things COVID made Zoom meetings normal. Jaspreet, you said something interesting. I want to kind of focus on the uniqueness of being a CRO in this niche. So you mentioned feasibility, super important. Site selection is very different than a traditional study. Can you kind of go more in depth on that? What do you look for in a site, for example, to be able to do one of these studies?
Well, certainly we look at sites that, as I mentioned, have security measures in place. So having federal licenses is critical when you work in controlled substances. So depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, that will always be critical. So in Canada, you do require a federal research license. In the United States, depending on the classification of drug and the level of the site, you do require a DEA license too, in addition to just a controlled substance license. And that's because it's still a very novel area to work in psychedelics in the United States.
Yeah.
Additionally, you are looking for sites with hybrid capabilities. Like we do look at remote monitoring capabilities. We look at proficiency in clinical trials in particular areas too. So recruitment is a very big thing when we look at psychedelics. You're typically, if you're dosing a patient, say in psilocybin, you could be in that room for 8 to 12 hours. So what is a set and setting? So heavily clinical settings don't work. You can't have fire alarms going off. You can't have, vitals or equipment on the walls because patients can tear that down while they're tripping, essentially, if you will. So having room for therapists, having the appropriate staff. So
washroom close by.
So
yeah, it's really interesting because we're so used to having these medical environments because that's how, but it's kind of interesting that maybe this is how, how COVID impacted how we do clinical trials. I mean, when we think about people's well-being, we think about the space that they're in, right? You don't want to see vital signs machines and all this stuff when they're going through this. You want it to be a calming environment. There's even publications out there that talk about set and setting, and set and setting is so important. And we're actually very excited because we're actually helping develop a center in Costa Rica, actually, Promises Innovative Recovery. And it's actually taking into account potentially group theory one-on-one. And as you can imagine, Costa Rica, if you want to look at set and setting, but it's not a retreat. It's medical research, but it also now has a setting. So it's nothing like what we've seen when we do clinical research. You look out, you have ocean, you have, you just have that common piece, and you've got the psychotherapy and psychedelics in a beautiful environment that's conducive to wellness. So it's very different than what we're used to.
So you're the monitor for that site?
We're building it actually. So yeah, so we're building our dream CTU and then bringing our clients to actually conduct research there too. So we're building it in an early phase platform.
I'm ready to be a participant. I'm just telling you there.
I mean, I would too.
I'm intrigued by the set and setting. Can you talk more? Because I'm used to sites like my site. Chris, I'm gonna put you on the spot. I don't even know if Chris is there. You are, Chris. We just had a study. We turned it down. Both of our PIs, we have separate sites. They both said no because they didn't have, which schedule was it that they didn't have the license?
Schedule 1.
Schedule 1. Neither had Schedule 1. They're like, oh, it's super hard to get. We have to pass. We didn't even get to the set and setting part because go ahead.
Say, the PI at my site in San Bernardino is very interested in the study.
Yeah.
In fact, he was interested in participating if he could, but very interested. And then when he didn't realize, which I pretty much did, that it would be a Schedule 1. When they requested his Schedule 1 license, he's like, yeah, I don't have that and I don't plan on getting it.
Why did he say he doesn't plan on getting it?
He just said it's too difficult. I don't think it is.
It's hard. It takes it's an investment of a lot of dollars, but it also takes a lot of time. So at least a year to obtain one. And you do have to. It's a significant financial upfront cost.
Okay, well, he wasn't
once
exaggerating.
you have it. But again, it's usually tied to if you have a large private research facility and you have a number of PIs that can be used in a number of different areas, certainly it can be used. Typically, academic centers usually have it, but there's classifications to what you can do with a Schedule 1 license. So in almost every single jurisdiction in the world, they have what falls under every license. So are you doing R&D? Are you doing human clinical trials? Are you doing animal? Or are you just controlling or handling the product itself? Right. So understanding what you have is critical. And I think there's the clear differentiator too. Like there's a lot of clinicians interested in participating in psychedelic-based research. And many want to take part in it just because they want to learn. How can you be able to help your patients and provide a duty of care if you don't understand what they're actually going to be going through? So that's why there's a lot of clinician education trying to be pushed, similar here in Canada, where a group of physicians really wanted to undergo microdosing to understand the aspect of psychotherapy with microdosing, but it got turned down. And we have a list of psychiatrists and psychotherapists and oncologists and PIs that we work with globally that are very interested, and trying to find them training is what we're trying to do now with Costa Rica. We've actually had to create a new sort of business model into our Costa Rica project for a client, just to train clinicians and PIs to get ready for these studies. Because it's very difficult to do this kind of dosing. Because again, the only way you can access this drug is through a clinical trial. And if you're training clinicians and they want to dose, that's not a study. That's a special access. You're literally asking somebody to say, can you give us a bunch of psilocybin or LSD or MDMA so that the clinicians can take it, so they can understand what it's like. That doesn't fly with a lot of jurisdictions. So we're trying to find a way to do it.
But there have been some clinicians have already done it. That we're able to. So MAPS does some training, and then we're seeing more and more organizations. What we're doing is really trying to, so that's the other thing that's above and beyond what a CRO does. We have to kind of look at not finding the psychotherapist, qualifying them, doing our due diligence to make sure they're appropriate, and looking at the training that's required so that they're ready to be part of the psilocybin study, the MDMA study. That's part of the planning. So it's not just feasibility and getting protocols done and all that other stuff that's already a lot. It's also concurrently onboarding and getting that ready as well. Because if you think about it, you have one room and one psychotherapist, and you have all these integration kind of sessions and all this stuff. You're already filling your calendar. So how are you going to have 10 a month, or, you know what I mean? So all of that is that operational planning, and the staffing is key, because you typically have 2 people to 1 person for many hours. So it's a whole other layer of
It's like a 9-hour visit, right? for
Yeah.
some of
Yeah,
these
and then
studies.
you have because you're not doing the psychotherapy at that point, right?
Right.
You've got to have that a number of sessions
So
later.
you're basically doing psychotherapy, like let's say they take MDMA, then they'll trip out for a little bit and
or long.
have for a lot of it, and then you do the rating scales, like, right? Is that the
Then you do
like the
the
gen-
psychotherapy. Yeah.
psychotherapy?
Yeah.
So it's different than the rating scales. Like are you doing like the PANS, MADRS,
Yeah,
HAM-D,
so-
all that stuff?
You're doing your assessments as well, but usually the studies are, I'm sure there's going to be studies where it's standalone, but what we're seeing is psychedelics with psychotherapy.
With psychotherapy.
Yeah.
Wow.
The MDMA one is with psychotherapy, right?
Because a lot of these psych clinics, I mean, Chris and I work with them. They don't do that much psychotherapy. It's just writing the script, have a nice day, come back in 30 days. This sounds like it's way more hands-on.
Yeah, it definitely is. An average study, if you will, has about, I want to say 12 visits associated with it in terms of baseline screening, integration, psychotherapy, and then follow-up care. And then we're also going pretty far back to, like, we're designing PK for a lot of these, because you have to remember that these are some of them are first in man trials that we're still at. We're not very far along.
Yeah.
So with every new sort of molecule that comes out, every new indication or therapeutic area that they're going after, if it's deemed first in man, there is a whole different safety component thrown into this. And a lot of people want to focus on real world evidence and observational studies, which is great. That happens at a lot of retreat settings to gather evidence, but it's not how you move commercial drug research forward, as we know.
Right.
That's not what you can collect to take to the regulatory bodies at the end of the day to say, hey, I want to submit an IND. Can I take my psilocybin-based pharmaceutical to market? An RWE study won't cut it. So we have to put all these measures in place. We have to find the right sites. We need to find enough psychotherapists. And this is another thing that's going to come up. You've probably seen a lot of psychotherapist training courses coming up, and there will be a definition or a point where we have to define when you legalize or get these drugs to market as a pharmaceutical. We know that with that comes a label, but we also know that with that comes who can prescribe it and who can provide that therapy. So is it going to be a psychiatrist trained in psychotherapy? Is it going to be a psychologist trained in psychotherapy? Will it be a mental health professional? It just can't be anybody who's an enthusiast or interested in being a psychedelic guide or sitter who enjoys the traditional aspect, which we do need to respect quite a bit, the traditional foundations of this. But you just can't be anybody who's interested in psychotherapy, taking a psychotherapy course online or at a retreat in Jamaica, and expect to be employed by a medical group that prescribes psychedelics. And that still is far away. That's a good 5-10 years away 5 to 7 years before we get to that point.
Mhm.
But we're already seeing a lack of trained psychotherapists for our clinical trials.
Imagine for just real world, because I'm thinking my head goes to the payers, because we analyze a lot of biotechs. I mean, at the end of the day, what good is the drug unless the payers want to pay for it? We've seen a lot of stocks get a drug approved and then payers say, well, we're not going to pay for it because it doesn't really show much better than what's currently out there. So like something like this sounds like it would be expensive initially, and then those costs at some point should level out, but you need the infrastructure in place. This is like 10, 20 years maybe. So you guys are super early.
And interesting you say that, because we also have our chief medical officer who's also trained in health economics. So that, and reimbursement, we have another person on our team that looks at reimbursement, because if, and that's what we do with our clients is we start thinking now what reimbursement, because if you think about it, I mean, we see ketamine out there, how many of the average person is going to be able to spend thousands and thousands of dollars? So it's a health equity question as well. And we usually work with our clients early to start saying, okay, before we do this, what is this going to look like? What's the reimbursement? And also, how are we going to now measure the comparison of what the cost is for this psychedelic with psychotherapy compared to being on antidepressants for 10 years, 20 years, and potentially therapy. And also, what is that health economic cost beyond just that, right? not being able to work, not being able to engage. And, there's so many aspects of it. And that's one thing that, we work with our client to incorporate that into the research as well. You don't want to be thinking about, oh, scratch your head and wonder how reimbursement is going to happen after phase 3 or when you're in phase 3, right? Because if your price is too high, you may not even, we've seen drugs like this. I mean, I've been doing this 20 years. I've seen drugs go to market and no one buy it because just, right? So you have to think about that in the beginning of the planning.
This is such a divergence from the paradigm of big pharma.
Yeah.
Have you gotten pushback or seen pushback yet? I mean, how are they allowing these small startups to take over like their moat or like encroach upon their moat?
I would say that 2 of the biggest psychedelic companies in the world are probably nipping on the heels in terms of capital size and valuation of some of the biggest pharma companies. They're pretty big. There's a lot of money behind them. But similar to cannabis, you're going to see a lot of the minute phase 2 data starts to come out, that's when you're going to see companies from a very business standpoint look at things like IP bundling, where we say we have our data and our results. It's open market. Who wants to buy it? In cannabis and cannabis specifically, the 2 biggest deals that have ever happened in the industry were pharmaceutical deals that happened in the last 11 months, with Pfizer buying Arena Pharmaceuticals for $7.2 billion and Jazz Pharmaceuticals buying GW Pharma for $6.7 billion. That totally eclipses any wellness or recreational financial bid. And so similarly, big pharma will let these companies, get out there, start doing the research, start building the relationships, but it's still a very nuanced area. We support large CROs in their clinical trials because they don't have the subject matter expertise to even go and find a site to conduct psychedelic research or understand what psychotherapy means or set and setting. So we're finding that we're doing a lot of support right now for big CROs and big pharma to understand this particular industry. But again, Merck's already been in the game. J&J's in the game.
J&J,
Pfizer, most of these companies have some compounds similar to it. But like I said, a lot of these companies are super big. They're already into phase 3. It's now a matter of who's going to file or who's going to look to sell their molecules.
So we've passed the point where they're going to fight this. They're on board now. It's just a matter of. I see.
But it's not really what is it competing with. I mean, we know that a lot of people
antipsychotics.
No. When we look at antidepressants, it doesn't work for everybody, period. Right.
Yeah.
And we haven't really had anything new come out for more than 20 years. So, I definitely we see ketamine. So I do think that they're going to be more inclined to jump in rather than fight it. Whereas cannabis was like the catch-all. It was kind of like invading in the pharma space a little bit more. But I feel like this is more, because the approach is a little different. It's very much clinical trials and that kind of focus. So I do see that pharma would probably more look at jumping in.
Yeah. What we say to clients pretty early on is if we're having difficulty understanding their objective, we just kind of ask them to pick a lane. Are you in functional wellness or are you a pharmaceutical company? And typically we say that if you're in psychedelics, you're a pharma company and you have to act like a pharmaceutical company that wants to get their drug to market. And again, making that clear distinction between academic-based research and commercial research. If you are trying to move your drug to market, you need to be very particular as to where you do your studies, which regulatory jurisdictions you select to start your phase 1s, all the way through phase 3, but then the market potential. So if you're eventually wanted to take your drug to market, what are the top jurisdictions we're going to? The reimbursement and the modeling comes into play. The financials come into play quite a bit. So we do look at a full spectrum approach for our clients to give them that glide path, if you will. And usually, which is very not atypical of traditional CROs, but traditional work that we do as, CRAs and researchers and project managers is when we're at our kickoff meetings and our scoping meetings, we usually have board executives or investors at the table with us or their bankers. So in real time, while we're trying to disseminate clinical endpoints for clinical trials, we're interpreting it into financial acumen for the investors to understand what are their financial endpoints too. So when do we need this money? What is the prospective valuation? And so our company is a mix of finance, research, medicine, a little bit of everything, because for not just cannabis and psychedelics, but for a lot of emerging biotech companies, this is what they need. Instead of going to like 10 different companies, we're hopefully trying to provide them with a platform to do this. And especially in psychedelics, it's very much proving its case that a lot of these companies do need that help, which is great. We're happy to help them, happy to make their trials a success, and help them get to patients.
Interesting. Do you think the Pfizer Arena acquisition is sort of a maybe a template or a roadmap for some of these companies like Tilray or some of the ones that come to mind?
Not for the larger LPs. They've vacated the medical space almost completely.
Majority of them have, yeah.
A lot of our cannabis clients are actually like very pharma biotech cannabis companies that aren't on anyone's radars, that have been very focused on drug development for the last few years, that have patents that on drug delivery methodologies, and we're already in phase 2 with them. So very different than the companies that are public facing. Like nobody heard of Arena before that deal happened.
Yeah. And they had phase 2, right? So, if pharma is going to be looking at cannabis companies, they're going to be looking for specifically pharma-minded, doing clinical trials and having some data. I mean, we look at that for small biotech. What do? They have enough money to get through to phase 1, phase 2, and then they sell, right? So I think that's what we're going to see.
I see. That makes sense. Ashley, Margot, welcome.
Hey,
How's
everybody.
it going?
Sorry,
I know you're super
didn't
interested in
wanna-
this topic.
yeah. Sorry. Well, nice to meet you guys. So sorry.
You going to
I
Costa
was a
Rica?
little late. I mean, if they will take me. I mean, I would love to. I know my brother personally, he's suffered from anxiety and multiple things like that, and so he's a real huge proponent of promoting everybody trying to give back to research through psychedelics and stuff. So I'm very interested in what you guys do, and actually, when I was first getting into research, I was looking at maps, but I didn't have a whole lot of experience. So my thought was to jump into CRO and then eventually apply to you guys. So, maybe in the future. But so kind of going back to what something you had mentioned as far as the environment's concerned. Do you feel that that's kind of the shift that might be happening in regards to, because like I know that as y'all were mentioning, the environment is a huge proponent on how somebody is going to be able to experience the whole thing, the whole scenario. But given how there are multiple, I would say, like Dan and Chris had said, like doctors' offices and things like that, they don't have that kind of environment. How do you see that along with the licensing is going to kind of prolong the adoption of this type of therapy?
We look for sites, like we have a site now, well, more than one site, and sites that are open to changing the environment, you know what I mean, that are open to, like, oh yeah, I have a phase 1 clinic and it looks very hospital-like, but we're open to looking at changing the mood, the putting sitting areas there, having rooms, specific rooms for the practitioner, the psychotherapist, having more bathrooms, for example. The last thing you want is, you've just had psilocybin and you need to go to the washroom and you've got to go up an elevator, you've got to go up another floor. I mean, that's just not, so it seems like very obvious things, but, those are important things as well. Yeah, so.
And I think what I'd probably just add is right now it's very popular, like for the past 2 years, actually, ketamine and psychedelic clinics. So psychedelic assisted therapy clinics are popping up. So Field Trip, Novamind are probably two that come to mind that are popular in the United States. So they're starting off as ketamine clinic with the interest in moving into psychedelics and therapeutic uses. But and there are a lot of these clinics. So in Canada, we have a lot of them. They're popping up in the United Kingdom. And the difference, what we know as researchers, is that when we're finding sites for clinical trials, we have a certain set of criteria. And whilst these clinics are specialty made or specially made for psychedelics and for psychedelic assisted therapy or music therapy or integration, some of these sites aren't conducive to clinical trials, or the sites may not want to actually change the way they're designed for research, because even though the setting is perfect, it's very calming, you have more couches and sitting areas and washrooms close by, there's no crash carts available. We have no vital equipment, so we don't have any medical equipment close by. So there's little things that we need to find that balance. And even if it comes down, you have an early phase clinic that's perfect, license are in order, the PIs are great, everything's aligned. If they could give up like one of their exam rooms, or if they have like an extra staff room or something too, that could actually be converted into the therapy room for that study. So little things that can be worked into the budgets.
For sure. And I guess the other thing would be, since you have mentioned multiple times, and excuse me if this has already been said, so, with it, even outside of more the recreational use, or even more specific to the more holistic use that everyone is familiar with, do you find that it pretty much helps with getting the word out and education out and bringing on potential subjects for the research?
Yeah, I think people are more open because it's being talked about now. It's becoming a little mainstream. I mean, I even see like fashion incorporating and decorating is incorporating mushrooms. Mushrooms are making a presence everywhere now, right? So it's really mainstream. Mainstream magazines are now talking about it, as especially that everyone has mental health on their mind. I mean, we've all been through COVID, and so it's very relatable, right? Like everyone's gone through days where, they don't want to get up, or things have happened to their family. So it's so relatable that people are more open to kind of looking at that. And we're seeing, patients with cancer, or patients that are looking at end of life, like in Canada here, a lot of people are trying to get access to the special access program, right? So people are open because what they've tried doesn't work. So I'm going to be open now. My antidepressants didn't work. Or some people I know with TBI, they've gone through the gamut of everything and it hasn't helped. So I think people are just open to trying new things. And I think that is making it such that we are getting a lot of participants that want to go into clinical trials, but we're still not getting that diverse population. So there was a study that was done between 1997 and 2017 that basically showed 82.3% were non-Hispanic white. And even when we did that, we did a while back, we did a psychedelic and cannabis conference through our nonprofit. And when we had people even communicating data that was recent, late last year, when they looked at when they talked about the demographics, still very much white male, right? So I think that, yes, we're getting people, but not necessarily diversity. And I was talking to someone that we're looking to, that we sponsor the MAPS Canada MDMA study. And they were even saying that that's a little bit of a challenge still, is getting diverse populations. So I think that, yes, we are getting more volunteers. A lot of people want to participate, but not necessarily. We have to still look at implementing those things that we know to reach out. And we need also, that study also showed that they didn't have enough ethnic diverse researchers. So really important that happens as well.
And that's actually what I was going to mention right now. That last part that you just said right now, is it the education due to lack of education on the drug, or the therapy, or the actual therapeutic aspect, the stigma behind it? Because I know that I'm from a rural area, and so predominantly Hispanics, and I know that it's very not very common for individuals to go to therapy in general, right? So makes me wonder whether it's the psychodrama or the therapy that's probably not getting as much of a, I guess you could say, like, catch, but definitely a lot of education for sure is needed. And thank you guys so much for what you do. But we actually have a question here. How big is psychedelic research in the areas like pain, addiction, and oncology related pain? And can you please throw some light on this?
It's very big. In terms of numbers, if we want to put a dollar figure to the industry, I think for between now and 2025, we're looking at $24 billion is the size of the industry in terms of R&D money going into drug development, clinical research, and just investment into companies. But that also includes not just research, it includes sites and infrastructure. I would say the research side in a non-academic sense, so commercial, isn't very big at the moment. You still only have a handful of companies that have the capital to actually run clinical trials. You also only have a handful of sites and investigators and psychotherapists capable of actually doing the research. So to Sabrina's point, when we start to pool resources and find PIs with experience that can kind of help, but also psychotherapists and sites with site licenses, it's very small. It's getting there, I think. Like one of our studies that we kicked it off in the UK, we'll probably be turning it into a multi-center study fairly soon, probably at the end of the year. And we will be reaching out to new sites to bring on board. I think it just comes down to enthusiasm in the market, more clinicians expressing interest, and sites actually being ready to do this kind of research too. But it's when there's licenses involved that require filings, applications, it's a catch-22. Where's the demand? Will we actually apply for the license, and back and forth?
For sure. Wow. Well, thank you for that. And now stating that we're kind of, in the last, I guess, 10 minutes, for those that more than likely that this is the first time, learning about MAPS and just anything psychedelics within research, pretty sure the most common questions are, are you all looking for professionals in research that are wanting to join your team, and how often is that, and are there particular roles that you are kind of in need of at the moment?
I think it's all dependent on the trials that we have, right? So, if let's say tomorrow we have a clinical trial with PTSD, then we're going to look for people with like project manager with that type of therapeutic experience, because when we look for people, they're not going to necessarily have experience with psychedelics, right? So it's really, we look at therapeutic area expertise. Also, patient recruitment is really important for us. So like, we had the PM we recently brought on board. She has a lot of experience with rescue studies. So we know that, and also so she kind of talked really great about how she looked at diversity in clinical trials, and those are all important things to us. So it's almost like matchmaking. This is the study. What are the things that are needed? And we know recruitment's going to be big because psychedelic companies tend to have a very aggressive timeline because they all want to get to market. So it's very aggressive, potentially lots of sites. So it's really just kind of matching, therapeutic experience that lends it well to that particular client and what they're looking for.
Yeah.
We actually had
earlier we put a call to action. Everybody reach out to Sabrina at Node Group on LinkedIn. We'll have her LinkedIn underneath. Jasper, yeah, we do have another question. You can get to it, but she basically explained the roadmap. It's important to have the CNS background. So if you're in the space and not in CNS, oncology, pain, addiction, try to get into those first and then work your way into one of these. You've got time. All right. This is the beginning. This is the early days. As a psychiatric site, like I'll sneak in one of my questions here I had personally. As somebody, Chris and I, we own some CNS clinics. That industry is always going through fluctuations, boom, bust, boom, bust. Do you think, obviously you guys are a little bit biased, but try to give an unbiased answer maybe. Do you think this is the new form of CNS therapy, treatment, research over the next few decades, or can they both coexist together?
I think they can definitely coexist. I think like the way we look at it is there is just one therapeutic in the arsenal of therapeutics that clinicians have to be able to support patients, because with any product, we know that there's a 30% chance it doesn't work with the participant or the patient. We know that. So I think that from a clinical from a clinical and a pharmacological standpoint, it's a very exciting area of research. We already know there's evidence. We know there's a lot of neuroplasticity evidence as well that shows to a number of different indications that needs to be further explored. But I think this just adds or is a contributing factor to building the portfolio of products and therapeutics we have to treat this myriad of mental health illnesses we have in front of us right now.
And another thing you kind of confirmed for us, so maybe there's a new psychiatrist just wanting to get started in research. Maybe they also have addiction medicine subspecialty. In your opinion, it's not a waste of time for them to get the Schedule 1. This is early, right? And maybe having in mind the set and setting when they design their clinic. Do you think that's decent advice for a new psychiatrist who's really interested in this, but also interested in traditional clinical trials as well?
I totally think so, because ketamine, first of all, ketamine is already standard of therapy in a number of jurisdictions. Like in Australia, it's first line therapy in mental health disorders. In the United States, it's second or third line, depending on the state or the jurisdiction that you're in. Canada as well. And the psychotherapy component is an additional component that's just part of the package. Psychedelics complement psychotherapy, not the other way around. So we need to be able to enhance everything. So I think having a Schedule 1 license, if it makes business sense to do it right from the very beginning, makes you more of an attractive clinical trial site regardless, because you now have a Schedule 1 license. But I think that building in that set and setting just for psychotherapy, which you can use for just traditional consults outside of research, totally makes sense.
Yeah, and we outside of looking for people when we start getting as every time we get new projects and things like that, we're always looking for sites. But we have also had psychiatrists reach out to us just randomly and say, they have their site, but they want to be involved in clinical trials. So, and they're open to being maybe an investigator at another site to get experience. So we're also open to that as well. So if psychiatrists, they already do psychotherapy, they already have that experience, but just not with psychedelics, they can contact us, because if we do have a study in the area, we could be like, oh, great. That's someone we could pull on. And we're always looking at training as part of doing the clinical trial anyways. We're just always looking for people that are interested and have the right experience.
We could splice that. We could splice that part out and make that its own piece of content for new physicians entering research. Maybe
Definitely.
something
Definitely.
positive for them to consider.
Thank you guys. Everything you'll share today. I mean, I need to go back and watch the part that I missed for sure. I'm pretty sure I'm going to come up with more questions, because this is really just, I'm sure it's just like the top of, the ice cream, however you want to put it. So thank you guys for all the work that you do. We really appreciate it. And we hope that we can continue to have you on here, and, to kind of give more and more information as everything progresses. But Chris, Dan, anything else?
I got my questions in.
Okay.
But thank you
Awesome.
guys so much for coming
much,
on,
everyone.
Sabrina,
Absolutely.
Jaspreet.
Thank you for joining us.
It was
Yes,
very
thank you.
interesting, and everybody watching and listening on YouTube, LinkedIn, or the podcast, whatever podcast is your favorite, links underneath to connect with Sabrina, Jaspreet, and the Node group on LinkedIn. So thank you guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.